Let's talk about rigor as a criterion that any undergraduate writer working on an essay about literature should keep in mind. This lecture is a somewhat extended version of what is already included in my one-page handout on rigor, also copied at my webpage on rigor, where this video is embedded and where you may be watching this. Feel free to follow along with those as I talk. If you've received feedback from professors saying things like, does not follow, not true, not so, faulty logic, fuzzy logic, bad logic, no proof, hasty conclusions, or something having to do with a logical fallacy, this is a criterion that likely requires your attention. A successful argumentative essay, and most essays that you're assigned will be argumentative essays, will genuinely convince its reader of something that the reader did not previously believe. In order to achieve that goal, the essay writer must use logic. Logic, a mode of argumentation that appeals to reason by presenting a series of proofs. Every statement in an argumentative essay must be provably, clearly, necessarily true. Every statement. In certain circumstances, there's sometimes a good reason to present a conjecture as long as you're clearly presenting it as a conjecture, but otherwise, every statement. One unproven, irrational, conjectural, or false statement, when it's being presented as though it is a true statement, will rightly compromise the believability of the entire essay, the entire written work. Now, there are multiple ways that you might use evidence to argue something true. 1. Present or analyze a quotation from or description of the subject on which you are writing, usually a literary text. Provide a clear citation of the source of your material so that your reader can verify it to be true. 2. Quote or analyze something that a professional scholar has written in a peer-reviewed publication, making the source and extent of the quotation absolutely clear. Important, you must evaluate the truth value of your sources with a rigorous critical eye. Just because it's printed doesn't mean it's necessarily true or rigorous. Professional peer review is not a perfect system, so if the source you cite is false or faulty, you and your argument are responsible for it. 3. Using the evidence that you have previously provided as a premise, draw a conclusion that is necessarily true. 4. Using the conclusions that you have previously drawn as a premise, possibly combined with new evidence, draw a conclusion from that is necessarily true. 5. Restate or reframe evidence or conclusions you have previously presented in a way that helps set up a premise for a subsequent conclusion. But note that reframing can't change the evidence. It can only repeat or reframe it in a new context. 6. Identify, and these are the two key ones for literary scholarship, I think. 6. You can identify a logical inconsistency in the evidence or conclusions that you have previously presented. That is a necessary conclusion that cannot be true unless some other necessary conclusion is false. You might find yourself disagreeing with the critic that you've cited in this situation, or identifying an inherent contradiction in the literary text you're discussing. Treat the logical consistency as a fact in itself, from which further conclusions may be drawn. 7. Identify an ambiguity in the evidence or conclusions that you have previously presented. Using a possible truth contained in that ambiguity as a premise, establish a conditional if-then statement that would necessarily be true. In other words, if you have two possibilities or more embedded in one statement, say, if X possibility is true, then Y, and if Z possibility is true, then A. Those two statements would thus be true. Then you can establish a conditional statement that would necessarily be true if the premise were false. So that's pretty dense stuff, and I encourage you to read it through again to make sure that you really understand what these sentences mean. It might feel a little bit dry, mechanistic, but that's part of the deal with rigor. It sort of peels away and gets to the underlying logic of what we do here. So make sure when you go through those seven things, you can understand what each of those 7 descriptions mean, particularly number 6 or 7. So it's by combining these 7 kinds of statement together, and while they're not completely comprehensive, they do cover most statements, most statements that you might make in a rigorous argument. It's by combining those seven kinds of statement together that you can formulate a thesis about the humanities. As you formulate a complex argument, every sentence of your essay should fit, and really fit tightly without straining, into one of those seven categories. Look at them again. It seems limiting, but it's not. Thus, any outlining you do during your drafting process should be involving logical connections, not just coverage. In other words, when you're looking at your outline, don't think about covering everything. Think about how each point in your outline leads to the next point in your outline via, say, one of these seven ways of presenting evidence. A pro tip here: outline logically, not chronologically. If the progression of evidence in your paper is following the same order that the lines appear in the text you're studying, like, for instance, I'll talk about chapter 1 here, then chapter 2, then chapter 3. If it's following the same order that it appears in the text you're studying, then it's probably not following the logic of an argument, right? Following chronology is probably not following logic. So, professors usually expect that a thesis will determine the organizing logic of your paper. By which I mean, instead of chronology, the argumentation of the thesis is the thing that determines how your paper takes shape. The word thesis simply means, and this is via the OED, a proposition laid down or stated, especially as a theme to be discussed and proved, or to be maintained against attack. To put it in short, your whole essay is and only is the thesis. That is, your essay is there to lay down an argument, prove it, defend it, maintain it, and explain it. And that's it. People often conflate the thesis with the thesis statement, right? Sometimes we say in passing, oh, what's the thesis of this essay? Well, the essay's thesis is only explainable via the entire essay, but the thesis statement is a succinct summary of the main points of your thesis, that is, of the whole essay. The thesis statement provides a roadmap for your fully formed argument, covering the main structures without yet filling in all the logic of how you'll get there. And that thesis statement usually comes at the beginning of a paper. A good thesis statement at the undergraduate level should take up most of your introductory paragraph, but it should be the last thing you write, or at least its final form should be the last thing you write. You may guess ahead of time about what your thesis statement might turn out to be, right? And you may guess ahead of time thus about what your thesis may be, but you really can't know what thesis you're summarizing in your thesis statement until you've worked through the fullness of your argument. That is, worked through the fullness of your whole essay. Remember, the essay is the enactment of, the embodiment of the thesis. No more, no less. So any guess you make about what your thesis statement will be ahead of time, say as you're outlining, must be flexible. I prefer to call that early guess a hypothesis, a hypothesis. That is, a complex but flexible idea for where you think your thesis might go, which you'll probably articulate during the close reading process. If you think about specificity and how I talk in the specificity lecture about stepping back from a close reading and seeing if any hypothesis emerges in the patterns, that's what this is, right? A complex but flexible idea for where your thesis might go, which is then allowed to grow and change. While the thesis statement is a summary for your reader, written at the end, the hypothesis is for your own use in drafting. You should be able to articulate the hypothesis as it develops. That hypothesis might resemble the thesis statement you end up with, but if your hypothesis doesn't change significantly during drafting, you're probably not being rigorous. Because during the process of writing an essay, you should be looking so closely at the evidence you're studying, trying to arrange it into where you think you're going, that you must be finding that things are different than you expect. If not, then you're probably not being thorough or not being rigorous, right? Read suspiciously. Actually, search more energetically for evidence that proves your hypothesis wrong than evidence that proves it right. Because then that evidence will add complexity to your hypothesis. When you find something that goes against what you expected, you get to complexify what it is you're arguing. And thus your hypothesis grows and changes to enough complexity that it requires a full thesis, that is a full essay, to explain and to argue. Right? Remember, if you are writing an argumentative thesis-driven essay, and most undergrad humanities essay prompts are argumentative or thesis-driven essays. If you're confused about that, ask the professor who's given you the prompt. If you're doing that, then the entirety of the essay is the execution and explanation of a thesis. It should include nothing less and nothing more. Usually an argumentative essay's job is not to lecture on something, to educate on something, to show that you have understood course fundamentals. That's not what an argument is for, right? Now there are, of course, other ways to convince a reader of an idea, ethical and unethical. Remember, as I said at the beginning, a successful argumentative essay will genuinely convince its reader of something that the reader did not previously believe. Remember, I said genuinely convince, and I use that word thoughtfully. There are other ways to convince people of things, as we well know, right? But none of those belong in an undergraduate humanities essay. We use the term fallacy to describe the manifold ways that an argument might twist or blur or sidestep or simulate real logic in order to convince a reader of something illogical, right? To convince a reader that something illogical or not quite logical is logical. I really like Wikipedia's list of fallacies. I know it's Wikipedia. I know I'm not supposed to mention Wikipedia. Remember, if you're thinking, by the way, about Wikipedia, I say I'm not supposed to mention Wikipedia in jest. Wikipedia should never be cited as a scholarly source. But I do think of Wikipedia as a great jumping off point for research, especially nowadays that Wikipedia has such thorough lists of references. Wikipedia is like turning to someone who has heard roughly a little more about your subject than you have and said, what was that thing again? And you get a sort of breakdown encyclopedically of it, and then you can follow up on more reliable sources. Much like this. Wikipedia's list of fallacies is great. If you're watching this video at the Rigor page, if it's embedded there, you can find a link to it below. Undergraduates often deploy fallacies, logical fallacies, in their argumentation without realizing it. I find most often it's the Strawman Fallacy. A Strawman Fallacy invents a specious or fake opposing argument, often an argument that no reasonable reader would get behind, so that the arguer can then knock it down and strengthen their position. You'll see the definition that I've just given differs a bit from the summary I've highlighted just here. It's also alongside the genetic fallacy, the I'm entitled to my opinion fallacy, moralistic fallacy, naturalistic fallacy, the tu quoque, you too, like whataboutism. All of these are different logical fallacies. But anyway, if you want to know more about the Strawman Fallacy, you can go to the Wikipedia page, click on that link, and it'll explain it more in detail. So again, the Strawman Fallacy, as I'd like to define it for our purposes, is inventing a specious or fake opposing argument to what you're arguing, often one that no reasonable reader would get behind, so that the arguer could knock it down. For instance, someone might be trying to argue that Alexander Pope's Rape of the Lock is an entirely serious, or rather, someone might say, some critics have thought that Alexander Pope's Rape of the Lock was an entirely serious poem. But, as I will argue, it's a comedy. Well, no one has actually argued that, and no one would. It's a blatantly comic poem, right? And so setting up a fake counter-argument so you can knock it down is the Strawman Fallacy. I see that a lot in undergraduate writing. Another one is cherry picking. That is which you try to prove an argument by ignoring evidence to the contrary, right? Specificity requires that you focus on the evidence that's relevant to your argument, right? So that once you've gained everything from your close reading, you focus only on what's relevant to your argument. But cherry picking would focus only on what proves your argument, ignoring evidence to the contrary. You'll see that alongside other faulty generalizations at the Wikipedia page. I really recommend that you find your way to the Wikipedia page now and poke around it, just see what it is. I think it's instructive to pause on a few different fallacies, especially the ones that are more cleverly named, whether they've been cleverly named, in the present day, or cleverly named by, Aristotelian logicians in the past. To think about, like, why is that illogical? Because it'll help you hone in on what we mean when we say logic. At base, an argumentative undergraduate essay about literature is a work of reason and logic. It uses reason and logic to approach something that is a cultural creation, that is based in emotion, that is based in affect, feeling, beauty. But what you're doing with that text is you are arguing something about it based in reason and logic. So that is what I have to say about Rigor.